The candles in the long dining hall at Allerdale Park numbered 46, and Marjorie Lyndhurst had counted every one of them, because counting was easier than looking at the faces. September rain tapped against the windows behind the guests, and the silver on the table caught the light in a way that made her borrowed gown seem even plainer than it was, the gray wool conspicuous among silks the color of champagne and claret. She sat at the far end of the table, below the salt, where Lady Cavendish's companion was meant to sit, and when the footman set the soup before her, she noticed that her spoon was not the same pattern as the others. A small correction. A detail the housekeeper would not have chosen on her own. Marjorie lifted the spoon and ate without comment, and at the far head of the table, past the Dowager Duchess and past Miss Arabella Fenwick in her ivory lace and her mother's pearls, the Duke of Allerdale watched her do it. His face gave nothing. His hand, resting beside his glass, had gone still. She did not see it. She was counting candles. If you have ever walked into a room and known at once that you were the wrong shape for it, that the air itself had been arranged for someone else, then you already know what Marjorie felt in that hall, and you may want to stay close for what comes next. The Dowager Duchess leaned toward Miss Fenwick and said something behind the rim of her glass, and Miss Fenwick smiled, and across the candles, Lady Philippa Hale's voice carried just far enough for Marjorie to catch its edge. "The vicar's daughter," she said, and the words landed with the soft precision of a pin pushed through silk. "One wonders what my sister-in-law was thinking." Marjorie's fingers tightened on the unfamiliar spoon. She did not look up. She had heard worse. She had heard it for 18 months, in letters and in drawing rooms, and in the pitch of servants' voices when they thought she had already passed, and the words had long since ceased to wound in the way they were meant to. They wounded differently now, not as insult, as confirmation of a position she already knew she occupied. Her father, the Reverend Mr. Lyndhurst of Keswick, had died in February of the previous year, leaving debts that totaled £400, which was more than a country vicar should have owed, and less than the cost of the ivory lace Miss Fenwick wore at her throat. The debts were mostly books. He had bought them compulsively, first editions and theological volumes, and a complete set of Cowper bound in calfskin, and when the solicitor had tallied the estate, the shelves held more value than the house. Marjorie had sold the books first, then the furniture, then the piano her mother had played before the consumption took her when Marjorie was 9, and the sound of the men carrying the piano through the front door had been the sound of a life folding shut. When the sum still fell short, she had written to every connection her father had ever mentioned, and Lady Cavendish, the Duke's elderly aunt, had answered. £8 per annum and a room in the east wing of Allerdale Park, overlooking the kitchen garden. Marjorie had arrived in July with 1 trunk, 2 good dresses, and a composure she wore the way other women wore jewels, carefully, and with the knowledge that it was all she had. Lady Cavendish was kind. She was 73, nearly deaf in her left ear, and possessed of a sharp wit that she disguised as vagueness. She required a companion who could read aloud without stumbling, manage her correspondence, pour her wine at dinner, cut her meat into small pieces, walk with her in the garden when the weather permitted, and tolerate her opinions on politics, which were numerous and frequently delivered at volume. Marjorie did all of this well, and Lady Cavendish told her so, which was a kindness the Dowager Duchess had not offered and did not intend to. The position was tolerable, provided Marjorie did not think too carefully about the distance between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The vicar's daughter who played the piano and read Cowper aloud to her father's parishioners and danced at the Keswick Assembly once each autumn. The companion who counted candles and ate with the wrong spoon. The Duke himself she had seen only 3 times before this evening. Once crossing the gravel drive with his steward, Mr. Bryce, his greatcoat dark against the September light, his stride long and unhurried, and entirely unaware of her presence at the east wing window. Once in the library, where he had stopped in the doorway and looked at her for 2 full seconds before turning and leaving without a word, and she had stood among the shelves with her heart loud in her ears, and no explanation for why. Once at the chapel on Sunday morning, seated in the front pew with the Dowager Duchess, his profile as clean and remote as the hills beyond the lake. Edmund Hale, the Duke of Allerdale, was 31 years old, tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of stillness that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He did not smile. He did not explain himself. He gave commands in a voice that was low and level, and people obeyed them, not because he raised that voice, but because he never needed to. Marjorie knew 3 things about him from the servants. He had been married once, briefly, to a woman named Charlotte. Charlotte had died, and the Duke had not been the same since. The house party had been Lady Philippa's idea. 40 guests, a fortnight, and at its center Miss Arabella Fenwick, whom the Dowager Duchess had chosen with the same confidence with which she chose the silver pattern and the seating arrangement and the soup. Miss Fenwick was 22, fair, accomplished, the daughter of Sir George Fenwick, whose land bordered Allerdale's to the south. She played the harp and spoke tolerable French, and moved through the house with the ease of someone who had already been told the ending. Marjorie did not begrudge her. Marjorie understood the machinery. A duke required a duchess, and the Dowager Duchess required a duchess she could manage, and Miss Fenwick had been raised to be managed gracefully. The season demanded it. The entail demanded it. The 46 candles in the long dining hall demanded it, each one lit for someone who belonged. On the 3rd morning of the house party, Marjorie was reading Fordyce's sermons aloud to Lady Cavendish in the small sitting room that overlooked the lake. The autumn light came through the glass in long, pale slants, and the room smelled of lavender and coal dust. And Lady Cavendish sat in her wing chair with a blanket over her knees, and one eye closed and the other fixed on Marjorie's face. Marjorie read carefully, her voice steady, her pronunciation clean, pausing at the commas in the way her father had taught her, giving each sentence the shape the author intended, whether she agreed with the author or not. When she paused to turn a page, Lady Cavendish said, "You read as though you believe it." Marjorie smiled. "I read as though the author believed it, my lady. That is not the same thing." "No," Lady Cavendish said. She tilted her head. "It is better. The vicar left you more than debts, child." She did not know that the Duke was standing in the corridor outside the open door. She did not know that he had been walking toward the library and had stopped at the sound of her voice. Not its words, its quality. The particular gravity of a young woman reading aloud with care and without performance. He stood there for the length of a full paragraph. His weight shifted to 1 foot, his hand resting against the doorframe, and in his face, had anyone been positioned to see it, was something that had not been there before. Not warmth, not yet. Recognition. The slow, startled registration of a quality he had not expected to encounter in a sitting room in his own house. Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, passed behind him in the corridor with an armful of pressed linens and said nothing, because Mrs. Pratt had been at Allerdale long enough to know when to say nothing. The Duke's jaw tightened. He stepped back from the door. He continued to the library. His hand, as he reached for the door handle, was not entirely steady. That evening at dinner, Marjorie was seated in the same place, with the same wrong spoon, and the same gray gown that she had pressed that morning with an iron borrowed from the laundry because the companion's room did not have one. Miss Fenwick wore blue silk and laughed at something the Dowager Duchess said, and the room moved around them like a current around two bright stones. Marjorie served Lady Cavendish's plate and poured her wine and cut her meat into small pieces and did not look at the head of the table. She was thinking of nothing at all, which was a discipline she had perfected in the months since her father's death. The art of emptying herself so that the wrong spoon and the plain gown and the distance between what she was and what she had been did not press so hard against the walls of her composure. "Miss Lyndhurst." The Duke's voice was not raised. It carried. She looked up. He was watching her from the far end of the table, past the candles, past the Dowager Duchess's diamonds, past the long silver runway of forks and crystal. "Lady Cavendish's glass is empty," he said. It was not empty. It was half full. Marjorie looked at the glass, then at him. His face was impassive. His eyes held hers for a count of 3, and in them was something she could not name, not command, not concern, something that lived in the space between the two. "Fill it," he said. She filled it. Her hand did not shake. Her pulse, at the base of her throat, told a different story. The Dowager Duchess watched the exchange with the focused stillness of a woman who catalogued everything and forgave nothing, and that night, as Mrs. Pratt would later tell Marjorie, Lady Philippa kept her maid an extra hour while she sat at her dressing table and said to her own reflection things she would not have said aloud in company. By the 5th day, the weather turned. The rain that had tapped politely at the windows became something else entirely. A sustained assault from the northwest that bent the oaks along the drive and turned the lake into a gray fury of whitecaps and spray. The wind found the gaps in the window casements and sang through them in a high, thin voice that set the dogs to pacing. The guests retreated to the drawing rooms and card tables, and the corridors of Allerdale filled with the restless energy of 40 people who had been promised riding and picnics and were receiving neither. Marjorie did not mind the weather. She had grown up in Keswick, where rain was not an event. It was a season. She would have spent the afternoon reading to Lady Cavendish had the Dowager Duchess not found her in the corridor outside Lady Cavendish's room, and said, in a voice calibrated to sound like a request, "Miss Lyndhurst, Lady Cavendish's tonic has not arrived from the village. The apothecary was to send it yesterday. Would you be so good as to walk down and collect it?" It was not a question. The village was 2 miles along the lake road. The storm was visible through every window in the house. Marjorie looked at the Dowager Duchess, whose face was composed in an expression of mild inconvenience, as though the weather were a trifle, and the errand a kindness and the companion's comfort a matter too small to weigh against a bottle of tonic that Lady Cavendish had not, in fact, requested. Marjorie understood exactly what was being done. She put on her mantle, which was thin, and her boots, which were worn at the heel, and she walked out through the kitchen entrance and into the rain. She was halfway to the village when the storm broke in earnest. The wind hit her from the side and took her breath. And the rain was no longer rain. It was a wall of water, driven horizontal by a gale that roared through the valley like something living, something with weight and intention. She could not see the road. She could not feel her hands. The hem of her gown dragged in the mud, and her thin mantle was sodden and useless, and the cold was not a sensation anymore. It was a presence, something that had moved inside her and was pressing outward against her ribs. She turned back toward the park and made it as far as the stone chapel at the edge of the estate grounds, the small Norman building with the narrow windows and the heavy oak door, where the Duke sat in the front pew on Sundays, and she pulled the door open with both hands and fell inside. The chapel was dark. The windows were narrow, and the storm had turned the afternoon the color of evening. Marjorie's gown was soaked through to the shift beneath. Her mantle was a cold weight on her shoulders. She pressed herself against the stone wall and tried to breathe, and her breathing came in shallow, shaking gasps that she could not control. She did not know how long she sat there on the stone bench beneath the east window. Long enough for the shaking to slow, and then worsen. Long enough for her fingers to go white, and then blue at the tips. Long enough for her vision to narrow at the edges, and the sound of the storm to become oddly distant, as though the wind were moving away from her instead of through her, as though the whole world were pulling back like a tide. She was thinking about her father's study, the warmth of it, the particular smell of old paper and coal dust and the leather binding of the cowper, and her mother's hands on the piano keys, which she could not actually remember, but had imagined so many times. The imagining had hardened into something that felt like memory. She was thinking that she was very cold and very tired, and that the chapel floor was not as hard as she had expected. The door opened. The Duke of Allerdale stood in the doorway with the storm behind him, and rain running from his coat in sheets, and his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his chest heaving because he had been running. He had been running across the grounds in a gale that bent oaks, and his face, when the lightning lit it through the narrow window, was not composed. It was not still. It was the face of a man who was afraid. He crossed the chapel in 4 strides, and when he reached her, he dropped to his knees on the stone floor and took her face in both hands. His palms were warm, shockingly warm against her frozen skin, and the contrast was so sharp that her breath caught, and her eyes, which had been drifting closed, opened. "Don't close your eyes," he said. His voice was low and rough, stripped of the careful level tone that made rooms obey him. "Look at me. Stay here. Do not close your eyes, Marjorie." It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it land in the dark chapel like a bell struck once, and she looked at him. And his eyes were the color of smoke after a fire, and there was something in them she had never seen before. Something cracked open and urgent, as though the careful stone of his composure had been struck by a force the same size as the storm outside. He pulled his coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around her. The wool was heavy with rain and warm from his body, and the scent of it was soap and horse leather, and something underneath that was simply him. His hands did not leave her. He chafed her wrists. He held her fingers between his palms and rubbed warmth back into them, with a patience that belonged to someone who understood exactly what cold could take from a body if you let it. "Breathe," he said. She breathed. Again. She breathed again. The rhythm of his voice was steady, a metronome against the chaos of the storm, and she held to it the way a swimmer holds to a rope in rough water. Something fell from his coat as he moved. A small thing, no bigger than a playing card, wrapped in soft leather. It struck the stone floor and the leather case opened, and Marjorie saw in the dim light from the narrow window the painted face of a woman. Fair hair, blue eyes, a mouth that curved in a smile so private it seemed wrong to look at. Charlotte. The Duke's hand stopped. He looked at the miniature on the stone floor between them. He did not pick it up. For 5 long seconds his whole body was still, and the only sound was the storm, and his breathing, and hers. And in that stillness Marjorie saw the wound, not a word for it, not a name, the thing itself. The grief of a man who had been asked to come home and had not come, and who had learned the cost of that decision in a letter delivered by a messenger whose horse was still lathered from the ride. Charlotte had died on the Cumberland Road, in a storm, coming home without him. He had carried the miniature in his breast pocket for 3 years, against his heart, where the warmth of his body kept the leather supple, and now it lay on the chapel floor between them like a confession neither of them had asked for. Marjorie reached down. Her fingers were clumsy with cold. She picked up the miniature and closed the leather case gently, and the painted face disappeared behind the worn cover, and she held it out to him. "She was beautiful," Marjorie said. He took the miniature. His fingers brushed hers. He put it back in the breast pocket of the waistcoat he still wore, and his hand pressed flat against the pocket for a moment, holding it there. "She was," he said. His voice was level. His eyes were not. The storm held them there for 2 hours. He sat beside her on the stone bench beneath the narrow east window, and he did not move away, and she did not ask him to. His coat was warm around her shoulders. His arm was solid beside hers. The rules said he should not be here. The rules said a duke and an unmarried woman of no fortune and no family did not sit alone together in a dark chapel with his coat around her and her head, at last, against his shoulder, because she was exhausted and the warmth was pulling her toward sleep, and he was the only warmth there was. The rules said many things. The storm said something else. When the wind finally dropped, he walked her back to the house through the gray aftermath of the gale, the grounds littered with branches and the air smelling of wet earth and broken wood. He did not touch her. He walked one step ahead, clearing fallen branches from her path, and at the kitchen entrance, he stopped and turned. "Go inside," he said. "Tell Mrs. Pratt to draw a bath and bring you broth. Tell her I sent you." "Your Grace, I am quite well." "You are not," he said. "Go inside, Miss Lyndhurst." She went. Behind her, standing in the ruined garden with rain still dripping from the eaves and the evening light thin and cold on his face, the Duke of Allerdale pressed his hand against his breast pocket and closed his eyes. The aftermath of the storm moved through the house like a second weather. Tom, the stable boy, had been in the yard when the Duke passed at a run toward the lake road, coatless within the hour, and Tom had told the undergroom, and the undergroom had mentioned it to the housekeeper's maid, and by evening the Dowager Duchess knew everything she needed to know, and nothing of what mattered. Not the chapel. Not the miniature. Not the whispered command. She knew only this. Her son had gone out alone into a storm for the vicar's daughter, and he had been gone for 2 hours, and he had returned with his coat missing and his face altered in a way that Lady Philippa did not recognize and did not like. She moved swiftly. The following morning, at breakfast, she addressed Miss Fenwick by her first name for the first time in the party. "Arabella, dear, you must sit beside Edmund today. I insist." She spoke at length about the Fenwick estate and its convenient proximity, about the excellence of Miss Fenwick's harp playing, about the long friendship between the families, and then she turned to the table and said, in a voice that reached every ear in the room, "My son has always valued a woman who understands the duties of a great house. One cannot expect a vicar's daughter to appreciate such things. The role requires a different sort of preparation entirely." The room went quiet for a beat, and then conversation resumed, and the words sank into the fabric of the house party, the way all such words do, not as a single wound, as atmosphere. Marjorie was not at the table. She was upstairs, attending Lady Cavendish, who had woken with a headache and a sharp temper, and a desire to hear no sermons of any kind. Mrs. Pratt told her that evening, not with cruelty, with the blunt care of a woman who believed that knowing the weather was better than being caught in it. "She means to announce the engagement to Miss Fenwick before the fortnight ends," Mrs. Pratt said. "Miss Fenwick's father has been spoken to. The settlements are drawn. Mr. Bryce has the papers." Marjorie nodded. Her hands, folded in her lap, were steady. Her chest, beneath the gray gown, was not. She had sat in a dark chapel and felt a duke's hands on her frozen fingers, and she had heard him say her name in a voice that was not a command, but something closer to prayer. And she had seen the wound he carried, and she had understood for the first time that his coldness was not coldness at all. It was the discipline of a man who had loved once and lost, and who would not permit himself the indulgence of loving again, because the cost of the first time had been a body on the Cumberland Road. In a storm, he should have been riding through beside her. Marjorie understood discipline. She had been practicing it for 18 months. She folded her hands tighter and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pratt," and did not say anything else. If Marjorie's composure moved you, if you have felt that quiet discipline yourself, you may want to stay for what comes next. 2 days later, the Dowager Duchess orchestrated her triumph. The formal dinner that was to serve as the unofficial announcement was set for the full 40 guests. The best silver was out, the matched set, every spoon identical this time. The Dowager Duchess wore the Allerdale sapphires, which had not left the vault in 3 years, not since Charlotte's funeral, and she sat at her son's right hand with the blue stones heavy at her throat and her composure absolute. Miss Fenwick sat at the Duke's left in white satin, and her father, Sir George, had been given the place of honor at the center of the table, and the room was arranged as carefully as a stage before the curtain rises. Marjorie sat in her usual place, at the far end, beside Lady Cavendish. Her spoon was the matched set tonight. A small concession. She recognized it for what it was. The Dowager Duchess's way of saying the matter was settled. The hierarchy was intact, and there was no longer any need to remind the vicar's daughter of her position, because her position was about to cease to exist. Lady Philippa had told her that morning, in the corridor, with the same tone of mild inconvenience she had used to send Marjorie into the storm. Lady Cavendish will have a new companion by Christmas, a woman of more suitable background. I am sure you understand, Miss Lyndhurst. I am sure you would not wish to remain where your presence causes difficulty. I understand, Your Grace, Marjorie had said. She had said it without expression, and then she had walked to the east wing window and stood there for a long time, looking at the lake and the hills beyond it, and the sky that was, for the first time in a week, beginning to clear. After the second course, the Dowager Duchess rose. The room quieted. 40 faces turned toward her, and Lady Philippa stood in the candlelight with her hand on her son's shoulder, and her sapphires catching the light, and her face arranged in an expression of warm authority that she had been practicing for 30 years. "It gives me such joy to see Allerdale restored to what it should be," she said. "My son has been too long alone, and the house has been too long without the presence it deserves. I am pleased to say that he has found in Miss Fenwick a woman worthy of this name and this house and this family's future." She paused. She looked down the length of the table at Marjorie, and her expression was not cruel. It was final. It was the face of a woman who was protecting the only order she knew. "One cannot build a great house on sentiment," she said. "One builds it on standing, on family, on the proper order of things." Her voice carried the entire length of the table. "A vicar's daughter may read well, but reading does not make a duchess." The room waited. Miss Fenwick's cheeks were flushed. Sir George Fenwick was nodding. The Dowager Duchess smiled. Marjorie sat very still. Her hands were in her lap. Her breath was even. Her eyes burned, and she held them open because closing them would be a concession, and she had conceded enough. She had sold the piano. She had sold the books. She had worn the wrong spoon and the wrong gown and the wrong name. And she had sat in a storm-dark chapel and been told not to close her eyes by a man who meant it in a way that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with being seen. She would not close them now. Lady Cavendish's hand found hers under the table and held it. Thin and strong and fierce. The Duke stood. The movement was unhurried. He placed his napkin beside his plate with the care of a man arranging the last detail before a decision that cannot be undone. He looked at his mother, and his face was composed, but something in the set of his jaw had changed. something Marjorie had seen once before in a dark chapel. When a miniature portrait fell from his coat, and his whole body went still with the weight of what it meant. "Mother," he said. His voice was level. The room leaned forward. He did not raise it. He stepped back from his chair, and he walked, in full view of 40 guests and the Dowager Duchess in her sapphires and Miss Fenwick in her white satin, the length of the dining hall, past every candle Marjorie had counted on the first night, past the silver and the crystal and the hierarchy that had decided she was no one, and he stopped beside her chair. The silence in the room was so complete that the rain, gentle now against the windows, sounded like something breathing. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Miss Lyndhurst is not leaving Allerdale," he said. "She is to be its Duchess." The words landed in the silence like a stone into still water, and the ripples moved outward across the table, visible in the turning of heads and the intake of breath, and the way Miss Fenwick's hand went flat against the tablecloth. The Dowager Duchess's composure, which had been a fortress for 30 years, showed its first fracture. A tremor at the corner of her mouth. A blinking that was faster than it should have been. "Edmund," she said. Her voice had thinned. "You cannot. This is not a woman of no family, no fortune. You do not understand what you are asking this house to accept." "I understand precisely, Mother," he said. He did not look at her. He looked at Marjorie. "I am asking you," he said. And his voice dropped low, meant for her, though the room heard every word, "whether you will have me." Marjorie's hands were shaking. She could not stop them. She thought of the chapel, the warmth of his palms on her face, the crack in his voice when he said, "Don't close your eyes." She thought of the miniature on the stone floor, Charlotte's painted smile, and the way he had taken it back and pressed his hand flat against his breast pocket as though holding it in place. She thought of £400 and a piano sold and a borrowed mantle that could not manage the cold and 18 months of counting candles and eating with the wrong spoon and hearing the words the vicar's daughter spoken in rooms she was not meant to occupy. "Yes," she said. "I will." The Duke offered his hand. She took it. He drew her to her feet, and for a moment they stood together in the candlelight, her gray gown against his dark coat, her hand in his, and the room watched. And the room slowly understood. Sir George Fenwick cleared his throat and placed his napkin down. Miss Fenwick's eyes were bright, and when she looked at her father, she did not look shattered. She looked relieved, as though she too had been carrying a role she had not entirely chosen, and could now, at last, set it down. The Dowager Duchess sat. She did not speak for a long time. Her hand rested on the sapphires at her throat, and her face showed something that was not anger. Something closer to the slow, bewildered recognition of a woman whose script had always worked before, and had, for the first time, failed her in the room where it mattered most. Lady Cavendish, still seated, still holding the hand that Marjorie had left behind when she rose, said to no one in particular, in a voice that carried precisely as far as it needed to, "Well, it is about time." Mr. Bryce, the steward, who had been standing near the door with a glass of port he had not touched, inclined his head. "The settlements can be prepared by Friday, Your Grace," he said. And the words were procedural, and the words were confirmation, and the room exhaled. The fire in the East Wing sitting room burned low that evening, casting amber light across the carpet and the wing chair where Lady Cavendish usually sat, and the small table where Marjorie kept the volume of Cowper she had not been able to sell because it had been her mother's, and she had hidden it in the lining of her trunk when the bookseller came. The rain had gentled. It fell against the window, in a rhythm that was almost music. Nothing like the storm that had driven her into the chapel. Nothing like the fury that had forced the Duke to his knees on the stone floor with his hands on her frozen face. She sat by the fire with a shawl around her shoulders, the shawl Lady Cavendish had pressed into her hands as she left the dining hall, and she waited for something she could not name, and the waiting felt like the silence between the lightning and the sound that follows. The door opened. He stood in the corridor, still in his dinner coat, with the firelight catching the dark of his hair and the line of his jaw, and the exhaustion that gentled his face into something younger than 31. "Miss Lyndhurst," he said. Then he stopped and corrected himself. "Marjorie." It landed in the room the way it had landed in the chapel, like a bell struck once. "Your Grace," she said. "Edmund," he said. "If you were to be the Duchess of Allerdale, you will call me Edmund." She almost smiled. The first time she had almost smiled in his presence, and he saw it, and something in his face eased. Some line between his brows that had been there so long, it had become part of his architecture. And for a moment he looked like the man he might have been before the Cumberland Road, and the storm, and the letter, and the 3 years of carrying a miniature against his heart. "Edmund!" He stepped inside and closed the door to the width of a hand, enough for propriety, enough for the corridor light to fall in a narrow line across the carpet between them. He reached into his breast pocket and drew out the miniature. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a long time, and the firelight touched the worn leather case and the edges of the painted face inside, and his thumb moved once across the surface, the way one touches something precious before setting it down. "I will not put her away," he said. "I would not ask you to." He looked at her. His eyes in the firelight were not the color of smoke. They were warm. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "She read Cowper, too." Marjorie's breath caught. A small sound, a thing the body knows before the mind permits. She thought of her mother's volume in the trunk, the pages soft with handling. The spine cracked at the poem about the winter evening. And she thought of a woman she had never met who had read the same words in this same house, and who had gone out into a storm and not come back. He placed the miniature on the table beside the fire, gently, the way one closes a book one has finished and will keep. He laid his hand over it for a moment, a private farewell that was not a farewell at all, only a shifting, a placing of one love beside another, rather than beneath it. Then he crossed the room and took her hand. His thumb traced the inside of her wrist, where her pulse beat steady and warm, and he said nothing, and she said nothing. And the fire burned, and the rain fell soft against the window of a house that was no longer someone else's. Outside, the oaks along the drive stood heavy with water, their branches dark against a sky that was clearing from the west, the first stars showing through the thinning cloud. Somewhere in the stone chapel at the edge of the grounds, the wind had finally stopped, and the bench where they had sat was dry now, and the room held the memory of the storm, the way old stone holds warmth long after the fire has gone. Quietly, and without explanation, and for longer than you would think possible. Thank you for staying until the end. If Marjorie's story moved you, leave a quiet word below and come back soon.